Okay, so let's continue our lifespan development series. And in this particular lesson, we're going to talk about physical and cognitive development in early childhood. So, early childhood oftentimes is referred to as the preschool years. So, let's go into that. Now, when we talk about some of the physical changes that occur, we see changes in height and weight. So, on average, we tend to see growth of about 2.5 inches and 5 to 7 pounds per year during early childhood. Now, it's important to note that growth patterns do vary individually. So, the rate of growth will differ across individuals, across cultures, and so forth. Now, there are other factors that are related to height differences, things like ethnic origin and nutrition are factors at play here. We also need to understand that the brain is continuing to develop. So, brain growth slows down, but by 6 years old, it's about 95% of the adult volume. And then, in terms of brain structure, we see increased myelination, we see growth spurts, especially in the frontal lobe. Now, as we talk about gross and fine motor abilities, we mentioned that gross motor skills or gross motor abilities are the abilities to move one's whole body or large muscle groups, right? So when we look at it, we see that we have simple movements at the age of 3, more adventurous movements by 4, and what we call hair-raising risks by 5. That's when the kid is climbing the fence and jumping down. That's when the kid is, I don't know, running on ice and sliding, things like that. Now, in terms of fine motor skills, the fine motor skills tend to be a little bit clumsy or uncoordinated at first, but you do get greater improvement of fine motor skills by 4 and 5 years old. Now, fine motor skills were discrete parts of the body. In terms of sleep, children are supposed to get about 11 to 13 hours each night without interruption. So, 11 to 13 hours, some people might seem, wow, that's a lot. I thought kids are supposed to only get 8 hours of sleep. Well, what you're seeing is it actually depends on the age of the child. At this point, because of there's so much brain growth and whatnot, you want to make sure that they get adequate sleep. Now, other sleep problems that can emerge in this time period of the preschool years, we can see narcolepsy, falling asleep spontaneously without prompt. We can see insomnia, and we can see childhood nightmares. Now, in terms of nutrition and exercise, in the United States, we have a high rate of obesity. There is a large amount of people who are either overweight, obese, or morbidly obese. And that can create some serious health problems in early childhood related to potentially diabetes and things like that. Now, in terms of who is overweight and whatnot, we see that 11% of people between the ages of 2 and 19 are obese, 10% are overweight, and then 38% are at risk for being overweight. I will tell you that the rate is going up. It's about 1 in 3 children who are either overweight, obese, or morbidly obese at this point. That's what the statistics suggest. We have the second highest childhood obesity rates. And then in terms of industrialized nations, we're number 1 in obesity overall. Now, exercise should be encouraged daily. And I understand as we get older, we may not have the time to do exercise daily, but At this age, between 3 and 5, kids should be exercising daily. Now, malnutrition is also a problem. Malnutrition is a problem throughout the world, um, and it's also a problem in low income communities. So, if we look at preschool children, about 11 million preschool children experience malnutrition. And if not for the meals that they eat in school, they would even be further malnourished, right? And one of the biggest things is an iron deficiency. And if you have an iron deficiency or anemia, you can be tired, weak, lethargic, unmotivated. You can have distractions, can't focus, things of that nature. Now, in terms of illness and death, the leading causes of death for US children at this point are car accidents, cancer, and heart disease. We also know that parental smoking is a major danger to the child. We talked about sudden infant death syndrome or SIDS before, but it is also linked to respiratory problems like asthma. Lead poisoning is another illness that we have to worry about. It's linked to brain damage in children, it's linked to autism spectrum disorders, and so forth. And we also have to pay attention to inadequate medical care. We do see disparities in healthcare outcomes across various ethnic groups and across the socioeconomic status spectrum. And this creates problems with health disparities across the board. So, if we were to look at the rates of or percentage of children between the ages of 1 and 4, you can see the number one cause is automobile accidents. Now, if I cannot impress it upon you enough, please get a car seat. Please strap your kids in to the car seat. Please make sure it's properly secured, because all of these factors could save a life, right? So we talked about the top three, but the pneumonia and the flu could be an issue. Bacterial factors can be an issue. Firearms, about 1% of deaths at this age are due to firearms, which is kind of alarming because kids at this age don't know how to properly or safely handle guns. It's something for us to think about as a society. Now, in terms of illness and death, so the healthcare issues in the United States and Western nations are different than in the developing world or third world countries, right? So, mortality rates are much higher for many of the world's children. When you think about surviving to the age of 5, things like infectious disease and diarrhea take millions of lives, take millions of children from the world. Other factors are HIV and AIDS or other viruses. These are issues. Now, from a cognitive point of view, we're going to be dealing with the pre-operational stage. So when we talk about pre-operational thought, we're talking about pre-logical thinking. Now, we have mental representation at this point, but we're not bound to the rules of logic. Children can represent, as I said, they have some mental representation. Now they're representing their world with words, images, and drawings. It's interesting if you look at artwork, it starts from little scribbles and hopping all the way to very detailed pictures, right? So they can develop reasoning by the end of this stage. However, at this point, they're dominated by egocentrism and magical thinking. So, egocentrism is an inability to think beyond one's own point of view, and magical thinking is sort of believing in superstitions as fact, right? Things like when you see a black cat, it's bad luck or things of that nature. So when we talk about the symbolic or the pre-operational stage, there are different factors within the stage. So there's a symbolic function substage where children gain the ability to mentally represent an object, even though it's not present. We talked about that in terms of object permanence. I defined egocentrism as an inability to see another person's point of view, being stuck in one's own point of view. And at this point, it's not about arrogance, it's just about a cognitive limitation. An animism or anthropomorphism, giving inanimate objects human-like qualities. That happens, for example, if you're walking down the street with a preschooler, it's not uncommon for them to say, hey, look, the moon is following us. Well, the moon is on its own orbit. It's certainly not following us, but they can give that human-like quality to the moon. All right. Now, one of the tests of egocentrism was called the Three Mountains task. So Piaget basically had kids walk around a display that had three mountains. And what you'll see is that you have the base of the mountain and then you have the three mountain peaks, right? So one peak was plain, one peak had a cross on it, one peak was snow-capped. And then they put a doll on the other side so the child is seated near A, right, on one side. They put a doll on the other side, location D, which is directly facing them. And then they gave children cards to pick. And they asked children, well, which one of these cards is the way you see it? And then they picked it and they got that correct. Then they said, okay, now Dolly's on the other side of the table. How does Dolly see it? And then they gave cards, and the younger kids in the pre-operational stage still picked their own point of view. And Piaget argued that the reason why they picked their own point of view and not the doll's is because they couldn't see it from another point of view. So then we have the intuitive thought substage, which is between ages of 4 and 7. So now we're starting to develop primitive reasoning. Now we want to understand answers to questions. Kids are always going to ask, why? That's a normal reaction at this stage. Now they do have difficulty understanding events that can't be seen, right? So, decision making can be difficult. Negotiating traffic can be difficult. And children know who they are, but they don't know how they know what they know, right? So they know their identity, they know who they are, they know information, but they don't know how they know. So if you ask them, well, tell me how you know that, they can get stumped. Now, one of the interesting things that happens is centration, right? So centration is to focus on one characteristic to the exclusion of others. So this is one of the problems which creates errors in conservation, right? So children might not be able to recognize changes in size or whatnot. So this is what we call conservation of objects, recognizing that even though you change an object's appearance, it doesn't change its basic properties. You probably have heard the law of conservation. So this is a physics term. Energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It merely changes its form. And that's another one of the basic concepts. Now, conservation tasks have been done in many different ways. So it's been done with numbers, so counting numbers. It's been done with clay. It's been done with length. So the way it works is you show them identically, right? And you ask, let's say if you look at the red circles, are there more red circles in row 1 or row 2? Kids are going to say they're identical, right? Equal. Then you say, watch what I do. This is a manipulation. You spread it out. So in this case, you might spread out row 1. And then you ask, now, are there more in row 1 or row 2, right? So kids who fail the conservation of objects task are going to pick the first row because they're more spread out. And they might say, are they still the same? The answer might be no, the longer row has more. Well, in reality, if we were using basic rules of logic, you didn't add anything, you didn't take anything away. So they should be identical, right? Same thing can be done with matter or clay or length, things like that. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna stop sharing and I'm going to pause the recording and see if I can get a video that I wanted to show you about this. Hang on. Okay, so in this video that I'm about to play, you're gonna see a young girl and you're gonna see her fail what's called the conservation of objects task. And then I'm gonna pause the video again and I'm gonna show you a second video. So let's watch her do her thing and then I'm gonna talk about it a little more. So she is engaged in Piaget's conservation task and she's 5 years old.
So I got some rocket fuel right here, and I'm going to pour the rocket fuel into a container for you. And I'm going to pour some in a container for me. Okay, is that close now?
Yes.
Okay, now it's the same. So I'm going to ask you again. Here we go. Do you have more rocket fuel? Do I have more rocket fuel? Or are they the same amount?
They're the same amount.
Great. We both have the same amount of rocket fuel. Now, before we put them in our rockets so we can go on our shopping trip, I have to take my rocket fuel and I'm going to put it into this container. Watch me do this. I'm going to put all the rocket fuel in here. Every last drop. Okay. Now, do you have more rocket fuel? Do I have more rocket fuel, or are they the same?
I have more.
You have more? Why do you have more rocket fuel?
Because that's a big cup, and a big cup can be. A big cup is shorter than a tall cup.
Okay, so we saw that video. Now, I want you to contrast that video with the second video I'm about to play. Okay, so in the second video, we have a person who's 7 years old. So there's an age difference. And one thing that we're trying to demonstrate here is that people progress through the pre-operational stage and eventually master it. So I'm going to play this video and we're going to talk about it afterwards.
I want you to tell me when we have the same amount of rocket fuel. I want to make them even. Are they even now? There, okay. All right, so now, do I have more rocket fuel? Do you have more rocket fuel, or are they the same?
They're the same.
Great. Okay, now, well, I need to take my rocket fuel and put it into another container. I need a bigger container. So I'm going to pour it in here. Okay? Now, is there more rocket fuel in your container? Is there more in my container, or are they the same?
Same.
The same? Well, how do you know they're the same?
Because that cup has the same and then you pour it in there.
Okay, So what you'll notice, right, is that in the second situation, the child was able to successfully master it. And I want to compare and contrast. When we looked at the first video, you could see the younger girl struggled. She struggled trying to explain why she had more rocket fuel. And ultimately, she didn't. But when we got to the 7-year-old, the 7-year-old was able to properly answer the question. Now, I talked to you about fluid, but I also want to show you that this indeed occurs with numbers. So I'm gonna play this video for us as well. And it's similar to spreading out those red circles, but because they're actually doing it with kids, they do it in a little more of an engaging way. So let's see what we have.
Okay, Jack, so the first game we're going to play is with these. So this row will be my candies. And this row will be your candy. Now, do I have more candy, or do you have more candy, or do we have about the same?
Yeah, about the same.
About the same? Okay, now watch what I do. Now, do I have more candy, or do you have more candy, or are they about the same?
They're not about the same.
They're not? Why not?
Because they're farther apart.
Because they're farther apart? But do I have more, or do you have more?
It's kind of a hard one.
It's kind of hard. Here's your row of candies. And my row. This is my row of candies. Now, do we have the same amount of candies?
Yes.
Yes, we do. Okay, now watch what I do. Do we still have the same amount of candies?
Yes.
Yes, and how can you tell?
Because even if those are spread out, you didn't take any away or get more and put them there.
So when we think about conservation of objects or conservation in general, it's interesting, isn't it? Right? We know that the older kids were now able to demonstrate basic rules of logic. So, and because they demonstrated basic rules of logic, they were able to get it right. So let me go back to the PowerPoint that we were talking about, right? So I'm going to continue with the slideshow. Now, in this, conservation is recognition that even if you change its appearance, if you didn't add or subtract, it's still the same, right? So in the red one, we did number. We also did liquid, which isn't on this graph, but as you pass the conservation of objects task, that demonstrates something about you. It demonstrates that you are now able to utilize the basic rules of logic. You have mastered the basic rules of logic. Now, we talked about in the pre-operational stage that you don't start with mastery over the basic rules of logic. You make errors, but ultimately you pass it. So, similar to the sensory motor stage where the major challenge that needs to be accomplished, we said that the major challenge that needed to be accomplished was object permanence. In order to move from the pre-operational thought stage to the concrete operational thought stage, you have to demonstrate conservation of objects. And that'll demonstrate that you're no longer operating in pre-logical thinking. You have the basics mastered. All right. Now, that was Piaget. Piaget said we learn through being active scientists, and we have this egocentric thought, and we figure things out independently. Well, along comes Lev Vygotsky. Lev Vygotsky felt that we don't learn in an independent way. Actually, the way we learn is through assistance from more knowledgeable members of society. And it's these more knowledgeable members of society that help us grow and achieve the way we do, right? But he was sensitive to the abilities of a child. So he talked about something called the zone of proximal development. And that is a space where the child has not demonstrated mastery yet on their own, but if they're given support and guidance, they could master it. So that zone of proximal development is slightly out of their comfort zone, is slightly above the competencies that they're currently demonstrating. So how do we move kids along? How do they learn? So according to Vygotsky, there's something called scaffolding. And scaffolding, you probably have heard this term. You probably have heard it in the context of buildings and construction. So when we think of scaffolding in this context, they're support beams, right? So scaffolding in learning is providing support and guidance along the way. So that's what parents do to help a child master a skill that they had not yet done. So when it comes to language and thought, children engage in something called private speech. Now, private speech is comparable to Piaget's egocentric speech, right? So egocentric speech, you're speaking from things from your point of view. Now, what's interesting about private speech is actually linked, according to Vygotsky, to things you've heard in society. So private speech is practicing or talking to yourself, giving yourself guidance, similar to the guidance that someone else might have given you, similar to the scaffolding you might have received. So whereas Piaget thinks that our thought and our language is internal and independent, Vygotsky believed that our thoughts and language is supported by others. So what we find, though, is the greater amount of private speech you demonstrate, the more social competence you have. Now, so in terms of teaching strategies, Vygotsky would say the first thing you want to do is assess where the child is. Understand the zone of proximal development, because it's almost like football. Think about it as sort of like a football field. So you have a receiver who's going to catch the ball, and you have a quarterback who throws the ball. If the quarterback throws the ball too far in front of the receiver, it's going to be out of their reach. They're going to drop it. They're not going to catch it. So if you try and be too ambitious with a child way outside of their reach, they're not going to grasp that concept. Similarly, if they've already mastered it, the zone of proximal development is further along. So that's almost like underthrowing a ball. So you throw it too close and they didn't catch it. Long story short, the best place in the zone of proximal development is where they have to stretch a little bit. They have to reach a little bit in order to learn. So first you need to do, according to Vygotsky, is assess the zone of proximal development. Then you have to understand that in your teaching and utilize and capitalize on it. You can also use more knowledgeable members of the class to serve as peer tutors. And what we found is that Vygotsky's ideas have actually transformed the classroom. Vygotsky has really shifted the way we think about teaching. There are classrooms that are collaborative teaching. There are classrooms where the ideas are generated by the students and the teacher follows. So there's a lot of more bi-directional exchange in this. So if we were to look at a summary and compare Vygotsky and Piaget, so what will, in terms of emphasizing the sociocultural context, Vygotsky put a lot of it, strong emphasis on socioculture, the environment, whereas Piaget put very little emphasis on the sociocultural environment. Keep in mind, he's a stage theory, so it should be more universal, right? So the environment shouldn't matter. Both of them were constructivists. Piaget was a cognitive constructivist, which means that they actively work on the information. So they're little scientists. They construct their reality. Whereas Vygotsky was a social constructivist. So for him, it was sort of like the environment helps. Now, in terms of stage theories, Piaget has 4 stages. We've talked about sensory motor so far. We've now talked about pre-operational stage theory. We're going to talk about concrete and formal operations in future lectures. But Vygotsky thought development was gradual. It was continuous. So when you think about that, he didn't have stages of development. So that's a difference. How do you learn? Well, according to Vygotsky, it's through zones of proximal development, interactions, communication with more knowledgeable members of society, and social support. Whereas according to Piaget, it was all about schemas, your worldview, and the shifting worldview and assimilation, accommodation, blending that new information in or adjusting your worldview. All of that helps you learn. Now, in terms of language, Piaget did not put so much emphasis on language. And what he did, he put more of a focus on the way you think as opposed to language. So the egocentric thought piece. Whereas Vygotsky put an emphasis on private speech, which is trying to understand what people are saying around you and role play it through. Now, in terms of education, according to Piaget, education system just merely refines the cognitive skills that have already emerged. Whereas according to Vygotsky, education plays a central role helping you gain skills that you don't already know. In terms of the teaching implications, Piaget viewed you as a facilitator, a guide, not a director, whereas Vygotsky believed the same thing. So both of them did believe that you're meant to guide them, but the focus is on guiding them cognitively versus socially. All right. So now let's shift to another concept related to cognition. So cognition refers to how we think, mental processes, right? So thinking, attention, memory, language, all of these things are part of the package. So from an information processing point of view, we have to understand attention. So attention is your ability to focus your mental resources and select information. Now, when we talk about executive functioning, we're going to talk about ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, not being able to filter out the most important things in the moment. Now, we also need to have what's called sustained attention, being able to hold on to and focus through time. So, where do deficiencies in attention occur? It occurs because people are not able to identify the relevant dimensions. They're not able to focus on the key factors that are important. So they need to learn to identify the relevant dimensions or pay attention to the factors that stand out. In terms of planfulness, in early pre-operational thought or in early childhood, kids are not very planful. They tend to use very haphazard sort of guessing strategies. I'm going to skip that slide, move on. Let's talk about memory. Memory is the ability to retain information through time, right? So we talk about there's short-term and long-term memory, right? So when we talk about short-term memory, it's holding on to information for brief moments. Actually, I want to say one thing before I say short-term and long-term memory. I want to say there's also a sensory memory. A sensory memory is a split second. So a loud noise, you have to decide whether you want to pay attention to it. Short-term memory, it's called short-term memory because it's limited in time and capacity. So limited in time, so it's roughly about 30 seconds if you're not trying to hold on to the information through rehearsal or repetition. It's limited in capacity because you can only hold on to about 7 bits of information at a time. Did you ever wonder why a phone number is 7 digits or a license plate is 7 digits? Like, why is it? Or it's not digits, it could be letters and numbers with a license plate. But why is that? Because the average person can only hold on to 7 bits of information. Now, George Miller said 7 bits of information plus or minus 2. So people who have weaker memories might only be able to hold on to 5 bits of information. People who have stronger memories might be able to hold on to 9 bits of information. So that's where things like your social security number, if you've noticed, your social security number is 9 digits. These are the kind of things that our capacity of memory. Now, what's interesting is that you can hold on to more information if you work on it. If there's an elaborative rehearsal where you reorganize it or create hierarchies, or you do chunking where you break big pieces into smaller pieces, you might be able to remember larger bits. So I mentioned the phone number is 7 digits. That's ignoring the area code. But you can even wrap the area code in if you treat it as 3 bits of information, 3 chunks, right? Area code, first 3, last 4. All right. Now, in terms of memory and efficiency of memory, our brain works faster as we get older, so the speed and efficiency of memory increases. So we talked about digit span. And here is an example of digit span. It's about 7 plus or minus 2. You'll notice that it kind of plateaus at about 12 years old. So your memory digit span increases with age, and then it kind of plateaus at adolescence. All right. Now, one question you might ask is, how accurate are young children's long-term memories? Well, I think we talked about infantile amnesia in a previous lecture. We don't typically remember things before the age of 3. However, there are other things we need to consider, is that the younger you are, the more susceptible you are to false memories or biased memories. And you can actually create a false memory in kids who are young because they're more susceptible. Or through various interviewing techniques, you can implant a memory or a distortion in memory. So you have to be very careful with that. Now, in terms of strategies and problem solving, so when we talk about strategies, these are deliberate mental activities used to improve processing information. So in early childhood, children tend to transform and develop into more flexible thinking, more goal-oriented problem solving, right? Now, in terms of theory of mind is a discussion. It's related to what Piaget said about egocentrism, not being able to see other people's point of view. But theory of mind, by definition, is the opposite. Being aware of your own thought processes and being aware of other people's thought processes. And if you have successful theory of mind, you can take another person's point of view into consideration. So you can see another vantage point, right? So when we talk about it, between 18 months to 3 years old, you don't really have that great theory of mind, right? So all you have are your perceptions, your desires, and your emotions. By 3 to 5 years old, you start to develop an awareness of false beliefs. So you understand what a belief is, what a correct belief is, and you understand the concept of a false belief, something that people stick to that isn't true. And that's starting to demonstrate some level of theory of mind. By 5 to 9 years old, you have an appreciation of the mind, how we think. And by about 7 years old, pretty much the midway point, you can develop awareness of thoughts of others. Now, in terms of getting false belief correct and recognizing false beliefs in others, if you look at the age of a child, the accuracy in identifying false beliefs increases with age. So that's also important to know. Now, we talked about understanding other people's point of view. I will say that there are some children who struggle with theory of mind. So if you look at research on children on the autism spectrum, they're not going to appreciate theory of mind and other people's point of view so readily. And I will talk about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is related to attention. So that would be where a disorder where people can't sustain attention or focus. All right. So now let's move to language development, right? So language, we talked about phonology. Phonology refers to sounds, right? Then we talked about semantics being words. And then we talked about morphology is changing of the words, taking a singular word and making it plural, making it possessive, making it past tense or future tense. So that's morphology. And then we talk about syntax as putting words into sentences. So let's talk about where kids are. So during the preschool years, kids develop greater sensitivity to the sounds of spoken words. They can make all the sounds of their language. By now, they've eliminated the sounds that are not related to their language. They demonstrate knowledge of morphology rules, such as plural, possessive prepositions, articles, and verbs. And they're starting to learn how to make sentences. So they're developing awareness of syntax, right? So changes in syntax and semantic. So they understand the placement of the word and how it makes a difference in a sentence. So they start to understand the rules. Typically in a sentence, you have the subject and the predicate, right? You have the noun and the verb, and then the effect of that verb, right? That's typically how we talk about language. So they pick that up. Now, I said there are 5 parts of language. They also develop pragmatics, which are the unwritten rules of speech. So they might speak differently at home, in school, with their friends. They adapt their speech, understanding that the expectations of them might be different. So if you want to increase language, though, one of the things that we see to increase literacy is to read to your kids, write with your kids, tell stories with your kids. All of this is going to help with language development. Now, in the classroom, there are different ways to teach, right? So we have a child-centered kindergarten, which emphasizes education on the whole child and demonstrates concern for all 3 domains: physical, cognitive, and socio-emotional development. That's child-centered. Now, we're seeing a lot of this now with UPK and 3PK, which are programs to get kids in school at 3, 4, and 5 to help them learn. But they don't just focus on learning, they also focus on their physical development. They focus on nutrition. They focus on socialization and friendship. So we are moving towards a child-centered model in America. If you ask your parents or grandparents, all they thought school was for is to learn. They didn't care about feeding you. You packed your own lunch, or your parent gave you a brown bag or a lunch pail. And if you talked with people, you might have gotten in trouble. So the focus on the whole child is something we're looking at today that we didn't always do. Now, the Montessori approach is another approach where the teacher is not as strict on the rules. It's an individualized classroom where the teacher views himself as a facilitator, and the child is given the freedom to explore their own interests and to be spontaneous. So it's not as structured or as rigid as the traditional classroom. Now, we also want to make sure that we engage in developmentally appropriate education, right? So the concept of developmentally appropriate practices requires you to create settings that encourage children to be active learners and requires you to reflect on the children's interests and capacities. So if you're going to teach, you want to focus on the abilities and interests of the child. So here's a summary. I'm not going to read off a summary, but here's a list of developmentally appropriate and developmentally inappropriate plans for teaching. So take a look at that. Now, there are individuals who are economically disadvantaged, and being economically disadvantaged results in some learning barriers. So what we found is that kids entering kindergarten and first grade were not coming into kindergarten and first grade at the same point. Along comes Project Head Start, which was created in 1965. It's a federal program which was designed to help low-income children acquire the necessary cognitive skills to be on par with their peers. So the question is, what is it effective? The answer is yes, it's effective. But one of the biggest problems is once you start school, many of these groups pull away these supports, and then the gap reemerges. So you have to be careful about that. Now, there are controversies in early childhood education. What should the curriculum be? Should it be focused on just socialization, focused on just the literature, writing, learning, alphabet, numbers, or should it be more comprehensive? So we also have a question whether preschool education should be universal in the United States. So you've heard the term UPK, Universal Pre-Kindergarten, right? So in some states, that is the way it is. So but there's a debate on that. Now, that in a nutshell is our lecture on both physical and cognitive domains of development in early childhood. I'm going to put a pin in it here. We'll talk about socio-emotional development in our next lecture. So let's stop. Take care, everybody.